Everyone wants to be Batman, and there are plenty of ways to do it. Same name, different game, 5 versions of Batman. Joe here. I'm a huge Batman fan, and tonight is the midnight showing of The Dark Knight Rises. I've already got my tickets and I am super excited. Batman's big, so for this episode, I'm going big. I usually do 2 games. This episode, we're doing 5. Let's start with our history lesson. In 1989, after 10 years of development hell and non-starters, a movie version of Batman was finally released in theaters. The work of Tim Burton, this was a dark take on the hero, intentionally in stark contrast to the 1960s television show. Michael Keaton played Batman, and Jack Nicholson played the Joker. And it is still Tim Burton's most successful film in terms of the number of tickets sold. Naturally, this meant video games. Lots of video games. Now, all 5 of the games we'll be covering in this episode are based on Tim Burton's 1989 movie. Sunsoft had the rights for console versions of the video game, so they released games for the NES, the Game Boy, the Genesis, and the PC Engine. The NES version came out in 1989 in Japan, although it didn't release here until early 1990. It's the only game to come out the same year as the movie. The rest of them all came out in the summer of 1990. The Game Boy version, then the Genesis version, which only came out at that point because of the end of Nintendo's archaic, draconian third-party licensing schemes, and then the PC Engine version, which never came to the US Turbografx for some reason or another. It probably had to do with the licensing being too expensive at the time, but it released in Japan in the summer of '90 as well. The final game we're discussing this episode is Atari Games' 1990 arcade game. Because Sunsoft only had the console rights, Atari Games, the former arcade division of Atari Corporation, that by this time was a standalone company, swooped in and grabbed the coin-op license. This game is sort of the black sheep of the bunch, and I must confess, I have never, ever seen a physical cabinet of this game. I always make it a point to record game footage from the original hardware, but given the circumstances, in this case, I had to use MAME. Let's start with Batman for the NES. The first game released in the string that we're talking about, it's still probably the most well-remembered. And with good reason. It holds up surprisingly well. Sunsoft's Batman for the NES puts you in the shoes of, well, Batman, and loosely follows the story of the movie, as do all of these games. You start on the streets of Gotham, then go to the Axis chemical plant, then, some sewers? I don't remember that from the movie. Then some techno base thing? I have no idea. This looks like a level that would be more at home in Power Blade or Shatterhand than Batman, but whatever. Then the final stage is the Cathedral. The music is great, the graphics are excellent for an NES game, and the controls are spot on. Batman has 3 projectile weapons and a punch. Ammo pickups fuel the projectiles, but the fists can always be used, of course. The batarangs are way more useful than the other 2 weapons, and they only use 1 ammo point each, whereas the missile and the dirk use 2 and 3 respectively. Learning to wall jump is a must if you want to play effectively, and early in the game it even allows for some shortcuts. The difficulty isn't bad for the beginning of the game. But here's where I get a little frustrated. The first 4 levels aren't that bad. In fact, I breezed through them pretty easily, despite having not played the game in probably close to 20 years.
It's the last stage that's the problem. It took me nearly 2 hours to finish that final stage. 2 hours to finish the last 20% of the game? That isn't a difficulty curve, it's a difficulty 90-degree angle. That being said, it can be overcome. It's just a matter of persistence and patience. And the developers do help you out a little bit. Like the NES Ninja Gaiden, there are 2 final bosses, but if you beat the first one, even if you get sent back to the final stage, he stays gone and you go directly to the Joker. Alright, 1 game down. Next up, Batman on the Game Boy.
Oftentimes, Game Boy games are just smaller versions of their NES counterparts, both in terms of scope and screen resolution. But this is a case where Sunsoft made a completely different game. It's still a side-scrolling action game, but it's much different. You use a gun, which is weird to say the least. The music is competent, and the graphics aren't offensive for a Game Boy game, but they're not what I'd call good either. The biggest problem with this game is the platforming is kind of horrible, and the fact that there's nothing especially Batman-ish about it. I mean, yes, you could swap out Batman for any generic pixel hero and the NES game would work too, but at least that game has some backgrounds that invoke the movie, and your most frequent modes of attack are your fists and batarangs. This game may as well be a crappier version of Contra with more platforming. Poorly executed platforming at that. Oh, and power-ups that are a handicap. I'm not kidding. The S power-up in this game makes playing the game like running with ankle weights on. The weapons just aren't balanced at all. On the other side of things, the Batarang weapon, which is super rare of course, is far and away the best weapon in the game. It's practically broken. This game also features a vehicle section, which the NES game didn't bother with, and is almost certainly better for. You fly the Batwing in what could charitably be called a Gradius-inspired section. The game only features 5 levels: the streets of Gotham, the Axis chemical plant, the Flugelheim Museum, the skies over Gotham, and the cathedral. Sadly, none of them are well done enough to evoke the film, and the final stage ends with an extremely tedious boss encounter against the Joker. The game isn't bad, it's on par with other third-party Game Boy games of the time, but very few of those hold up.
You'd be better off playing Ninja Gaiden Shadow or Gargoyle's Quest if you're looking for an action romp on the old black and white. Alright, moving on to the Genesis game. Now this was a hotly anticipated title. Fans were hoping for a bigger, prettier version of the NES game.
Batman on the Genesis is definitely prettier than the NES game, but it isn't much bigger and it isn't like the NES game. This one also is a side-scrolling platformer. You might be noticing a trend here, but this game goes the opposite way of the Game Boy version. Your primary weapon is your fist, and projectiles are very rare, but useful when they can be found. You get batarangs by grabbing little bat symbols, but only 5 per pickup, and they're tough to come by. The game is okay. I mean, it's nothing groundbreaking, a little on the bland side, but competent. You walk to the right and punch guys. It's a lot like Irem's Kung Fu, in fact. Well, except for the part with the batarangs, but mostly it's just walk and punch. This one also has vehicle sections featuring the Batmobile and the Batwing. Both sections are auto-scrolling shooters, very similar to the Game Boy, but neither are that good. I mean, not terrible, just nothing to write home about. The game also feels really cheap in some parts, the cathedral especially. The boss encounters run the gamut from stupid easy to insanely cheap and frustrating, oddly enough with the Joker being in the former group. This is also the only game of the bunch to have limited continues, and you know how I feel about that.
I guess that brings us to the other 16-bit version. Batman for the PC Engine. Now, this one never came over here as we've discussed, and, well, I've heard a story that originally it was slated to be a follow-up to the NES game, a bigger, better, prettier version of that game, what the fans wanted from the Genesis game. But allegedly, and I can't confirm this, there was a falling out between Sunsoft and NEC, which led to the final product being made. This game, well, it's fun for a few minutes.
The PC Engine Batman game has frequently been compared to Pac-Man, but that's a misguided comparison. To me, it evokes a mediocre Bomberman. Oh, fuck no, it's better than that. The biggest problem with the game is that it has nearly 50 levels, and the only difference between them are the tile sets and the MacGuffin in each one. They come in sets of 12, starting with the streets of Gotham, the museum, Axis Chemical, and then back to the Gotham streets. There's a final boss battle in the cathedral after that, but not really a full set of levels. There are no vehicle segments, no side-scrolling segments, just a whole bunch of not quite Bomberman. Each stage has its own goal, but it's just a matter of different window dressing. You recover the Joker's poison cosmetics, you clean the paintings in the museum, you plant bombs in the chemical plant, you cut the poison gas balloons loose, but functionally they're all the same. Find all the things in each level, rinse, repeat for 12 levels at a clip. The worst part is that when you start, you're extremely slow. You can only throw one Batarang that doesn't go very far and is extremely slow as well. With power-ups, you can eventually get to be a swift Batman with several Batarangs at your disposal that go all the way across the screen. But Batman can only take one hit, and when you run out of lives, you start over with slow, one Batarang, no distance Batman. Enemies can only be stopped by stunning them first with a Batarang and then walking into them. They respawn in about a minute though, so it's just a temporary reprieve. The game isn't especially hard, except when you continue, but it wears you down. There's no variety, and when you face the bosses at the very end of the game, they're too easy. The game wasn't designed with boss battles in mind. They're chumps. The saving grace of this game are the graphics and the sound. The soundtrack shares several tracks with the NES game, and they sound even better on the PC Engine. The cutscenes also look fantastic and really bring you back into the story, even if the gameplay itself isn't that great. The Genesis games certainly could have been on par in this arena, but the Genesis title is very light on story sequences, where the PC Engine has several.
Now, if you're a collector, I would still say pick this one up if you see it. It's not rare on the level of Rennie Blaster or Dracula X, but it's still a really cool little curiosity bit of history, and especially if you're a Batman fan like me. Alright, so that brings us to the last game of our Bat Special, which is Atari Games' arcade version. Now, the funny thing about this version is it's the only version to use Danny Elfman's iconic Batman score as the music, and audio-visually speaking, it's worlds ahead of all the other titles we're talking about. Now, one thing you have to remember is that in 1990, arcade hardware was so much more advanced than anything on home consoles, it really wasn't a level audio-visual playing field. Forgetting about that a second, what about the gameplay?
Well, to be honest, it isn't that great. I mean, it's not horrible. It's pretty similar to the Genesis game, with a little more variety and much better looking. This game offers 3 power-ups, including the Bat Rope that allows you to reach greater heights faster. It also features a ton of voice samples from the movie, which none of the other games do. But at its core, the game is Shinobi. The mechanics are almost identical to the original Shinobi, which itself lifted mechanics from Rolling Thunder. Now, do keep in mind that an arcade game at this time could do alright on the strength of its aesthetics. That doesn't mean that it will hold up today. It does, however, make the vehicle segments much better than the other games we've talked about. Scaling that just wasn't possible on home consoles give this game the best vehicle segments. It also makes the Batwing segment the most film-accurate and fun out of any of them. Still, at its core, it's just an okay side-scroller with lopsided boss battles and swarms of enemies that were either an attempt to show off the technology or just meant to fuck the player out of more quarters.
Now, let's do some direct comparisons. Let's talk about the storyline, how the games relate to the movie they're based on. Surprisingly, the NES game is the weakest in this arena, using only 3 levels that pull from the movie and abbreviated cutscenes. The other 2 stages are just video game stages. Certainly the next weakest would be the Game Boy version, as it has levels that technically pull from the movie but don't look the part at all, and really abbreviated cutscenes. Next I would say is the Genesis. It uses the scenery, the level design really evokes the film, even if there are very, very few cutscenes. Then the PC Engine version. The PC Engine version has great cutscenes that really show you the movie, but the gameplay doesn't work with the character at all. You don't feel like Batman when you're playing it. And then, of course, is the arcade game, which again, totally uneven playing field, but definitely does the best job of making you think about this movie and the character.
Okay, this is a little cluttered, but bear with me, we've got 5 games to squeeze onto one screen here. It's simply no contest. The arcade game follows the story better than any other. That doesn't make it the best game, though.
But before we get there, let's talk graphics and sound, like we do. Now, again, the arcade version is the only version to use the original film score by Danny Elfman, but the console versions have some pretty kick-ass soundtracks too. In terms of those games, I would say the PC Engine has the best score and is really the only place where it excels, followed very closely by the NES game, then the Genesis game, and trailing is the Game Boy version. Graphically speaking, it shakes out a little differently. Again, the arcade game, digitized images, really great graphics, but not a fair comparison. Console-wise, we're talking about the Genesis version, then the PC Engine version, then the NES game, and of course, the black and white Game Boy game. Now, let's try a comparison. Alright, it's time to give the edge. This one is easy. I mean, come on, we all know where this is going, right? The NES game is tops. It's no contest. Yes, it doesn't really evoke the movie all that well, but that's its strength. Being a slavish adaptation is what drives down some of these other games. I mean, think about it. The movie itself is successful because it's different than the comic books. It's a movie, a work that stands on its own. Now, as for this game, it's considered an NES classic for a reason. It's just plain good. The gameplay is awesome, the controls are tight, the graphics are awesome for an NES game, the soundtrack is fantastic. It's just a really, really solid title. It's also really, really common and really, really cheap. So if you own an NES, there is no excuse not to have the copy of this game. The second tier, we're talking about the Genesis game and the arcade game. They're not great, but they're not horrible either. They're kind of derivative, but they're still fun. If you're a big retro gaming fan, or if you're a big Batman fan, you should definitely check out both of these games. They don't take too long to play through, and they're cool. The bottom tier, the Game Boy and the PC Engine. Now let me be clear, the Game Boy version is definitely the worst game we talked about today. I mean, it's crappy, the music isn't that good, it doesn't evoke the character or the movie, it just doesn't work. This game is at least fun for a few minutes and the soundtrack is amazing. That being said, it still gets boring after a few minutes and it's not what I would call a good game by any stretch. So those two, buyer beware unless you're a huge collector or a big time Bat fan. Alright, that's it for this episode. I gotta go get ready to go check out The Dark Knight Rises tonight at midnight, and I'm sure a lot of you are doing the same thing. So I'll see you next time, right here on Same Name, Different Game.